Today we're looking at a video from this classy fellow, Brian Holdsworth, who I've responded to once before, and I wasn't a huge fan of that video, but maybe this one will be better. This one's called How Matter Proves the Soul, and he starts off with a bit of an apology for that title being too provocative, and explaining that YouTube disincentivizes long, comprehensive titles, which every medium disincentivizes, and then goes on to explain what he's actually talking about, which is this.
So what I'm actually arguing in this video is that our perception or understanding of matter is evidence that we are more than material. That is, we are also spiritual beings.
Which sounds like quite the hurdle. I'm skeptical as to whether this hurdle can be cleared in any meaningful way, but I guess I'll wait and see what the video has in store for us and decide then.
Okay, so to explain what I mean by that, let's start with an analogy.
Oh, okay. I never end up liking these, except my own. Those ones are really good, but the rest of them,
Imagine if we were all colorblind and the only color we could perceive is what we currently understand to be the color blue, and then no other colors were perceptible to us. All we could see are shades of blue light. But if that were the case, then the word and the concept blue would be meaningless to us because it is only meaningful to us currently because it is a distinguishing feature.
I want to clarify something here, and having looked ahead in your video, I think this will play into your point more than refute it, which is fine. I want to give you the most I possibly can. And my clarification is that just because you're colorblind, that doesn't make you unaware of different colors of light. Maybe way in the past, when we didn't know about wavelength, for example, that would be true. But nowadays, it's not. Right now, you can say that all humans are still colorblind. We're not limited to seeing blue, we're limited to seeing the entire spectrum of visible light, which is only the tiniest little sliver of the full light spectrum. And so we're completely colorblind to anything to the infrared side or the ultraviolet side. And all the wavelengths to each of those sides are colors in the exact same way that the different wavelengths within the visible light spectrum are colors. And yet we're aware of their existence. And so despite being totally colorblind to them, referring to them makes sense. And referring to visible light also makes sense. And in the same way, a person who's completely colorblind to every color except blue would not find the idea of blue as a color or the idea of other colors to be incomprehensible or meaningless. Hard to imagine visually, maybe. For example, try to imagine the color of an X-ray right now. You can't. If you try to put a color on that, it's going to match some other color that your brain already maps to some other wavelength of light. But we're not talking about what you can picture in your mind, we're talking about what words have meaning to you. I should also point out, I understand that the point is to say that if you only know of one color, it's hard to understand the idea of color more generally. But if we can see the whole visible light spectrum, the idea is a little bit easier to grasp and to intuit. I get that. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, and eventually we're going to see how this actually applies to your real argument. I'm not actually convinced that it does apply to your real argument. This whole blue thing seems to be kind of a pointless false analogy for what you're actually trying to say. But anyway, on we go.
We only understand and have awareness of the color blue because we have perception of that which it is distinct from, which is to say, other colors.
Yeah, and likewise, we have perception of wavelengths of light beyond the visible light spectrum. Indirect perception through technology, but perception nonetheless. And so my real objection before was just that the colorblindness example specifically doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because even if you're colorblind, you can still have awareness of other wavelengths of light beyond the ones that you can perceive. But I understand that to make the distinction between visible light, say, or blue, and other wavelengths of light that you can't perceive, requires you at least to have the idea that there might be other colors or other wavelengths. You can't comprehend an idea that you don't have. But I will say that once the idea is presented to you, the idea itself can make sense regardless of whether or not it reflects reality. For example, when I was young, I read a science fiction story about a boy who I think travels to another dimension or something, and sees colors that he'd never seen in his own world, colors that never would have even occurred to him. And as a boy myself who'd never heard of anything like wavelength or ultraviolet or infrared, this idea immediately clicked with me. It wasn't some alien concept. Of course, I couldn't picture any different colors that I hadn't seen before. I wouldn't be able to perceive them even if you showed them to me. I'm limited to the colors that I can in fact perceive. And yet the idea of being able to perceive more makes perfect sense. And likewise, if a person who can only see blue were to look at my video editor right now, here it is, well, that person would be seeing many different shades of blue. And those blues and all the other blues would be this person's total perception of color. But it would still make sense to this person if you said, there are other colors you can perceive. And of course, when this person tried to imagine it, they either just wouldn't see anything in their head, or would see variations of blue and try to perceive that as being a different color. This person would not be able to visualize colors from the rest of the visible spectrum or the rest of the spectrum generally. But I don't think that the idea itself would be confusing, and I don't think the idea itself would be inaccessible. Now, if a person has no experience with color whatsoever, like someone who's been blind for life, it can be a hard idea to grasp and even harder to discover. That would probably also go for someone who had very, very limited experience with color, like, for example, only one specific shade of blue. Someone who just sees the world as a flat field of one particular blue. It would be pretty hard to come up with the idea that there would be some other color. Although to say that it's not possible, to me seems incredibly dubious. That would require some serious support. But assuming any distinction at all, even if a person just saw black and white, total black and total white, nothing in between, with no shades of distinction at all, that person would have the understanding of different, so to speak, colors, of the idea that things can vary in that aspect of their appearance. And so the idea that there could be something different from either black or white isn't such a stretch. I don't see a reason to assume that it's true that the idea of other colors would have to follow from the actual perception of other colors.
Blue only has meaning for us because we know of other colors like red and green as well.
Initially, it would be that way at least, sure. Maybe a child couldn't come up with the idea that there could be something beyond it. Maybe generations of people or millennia of people wouldn't come up with this idea. Who knows? But I don't see any reason to assume that it would be impossible that at some point people would come up with these ideas. People do that all the time. People always talk about, but what if there's more than this? Whatever this happens to be. And they have no direct experience with it whatsoever. The more that they come up with might be completely fantastical. It might be completely beyond the realms of any human experience, and it might be totally false. And yet people come up with these kinds of ideas all the time. Humans have a vibrant imagination, and I'll grant readily that the human imagination is often very closely tied to our experiences in the real world. The things we imagine are often modifications or some sort of extension or even inference from something that we experience in our lives. And something like that goes for a person who can only see blue coming up with the idea of something that's not blue. That's just extending the idea of all the different shades of blue to, well, what if there are shades that I can't see? What if there's something like this, but just more, different? Or maybe even a question like, what's the opposite of this? Or what's the negation of this? People love those questions.
But if we were colorblind, then we wouldn't know about other colors, and therefore any attempt to describe an individual color as if it were distinct from other colors would sound like nonsense and superstition to us.
Superstition, possibly. Nonsense, though, I'm not so sure. I think the idea would make sense, even if people thought it referred to something fictional. You're proposing this very strict limitation on the human imagination that I don't know if you can really back up. I'm willing to hear you out, but you don't seem to be really trying. You're just sort of saying it. In any case, though, I can't believe I've spent this long on something that's not even the actual topic of the video.
But because we aren't colorblind, we do know what blue means. We recognize when a thing is blue and when it's not blue. Blue is only meaningful to us because some things are not blue. If everything were blue, then blue would be an incomprehensible concept and word to us.
Right, and this starts to get us into the actual point that you're getting to, which is not about the word blue. It's about another word, and the question of whether it would be possible for us to come up with the idea of something that is not that. Broadly, you'll find that the question here is it possible that an idea can make sense to us if we don't have the idea of its negation too? Can it make sense to us to say that something is X without the idea that it could be not X? And if we have the idea of not X, he takes that to mean that we therefore must have an experience with the actual reality of not X, because supposedly this is the only way to reach an idea of not X. So you have to really experience real colors that are not blue, so that you have something against which to distinguish blue, because otherwise you won't bother having the concept of blue. The basic assertion is that this cannot be done conceptually. This has to be done by real experience. And so up until this point in the conversation, where we've still just been talking about the word blue, there's been another word that keeps popping into my head. It's not the one he wants to talk about, it's one that I find far more relevant. And that word is real. Everything that we experience is real. We're immersed in reality. And yet by this reasoning, for it to make any sense at all, for it to be even comprehensible to say that something is real, for me to even have the concept of this, I need to have the idea of something that's not real. And the only way to get this idea is by experiencing something that's not real. So for me to even be able to understand, let alone come up with the idea of real, that which is unreal must be real, and part of my real experience. This is a much better example than the word blue, because this starts to show the underlying flaw of this entire video, specifically that the premises are wrong and lead to paradoxes.
Okay, so what about the word matter or material or that which is made of matter? Because there are plenty of people like materialists who believe that matter, the physical world, is all that there is, and furthermore, that we ourselves are merely material beings.
Reality, the real world, is all that there is, and furthermore, we ourselves are real beings. But so yeah, the word that he wants to talk about is material.
But like we saw in the example of color, if everything was blue, then blue would be a meaningless word. But the word matter does mean something to us, which means that it must be a word with some distinguishing power. If everything is material, then the word material would be meaningless to us, just like if everything was blue, then the word blue would be meaningless to us. But matter is a word that does mean something to us. But how can that be possible unless it distinguishes from immaterial reality or the incorporeal?
Where should I even start with this? Okay. First, blue and material are not alike enough to compare them in this way. Blue describes an aspect of raw human perception, pure sense experience. And the reason that it could be challenging to think beyond that, or to even realize there's an it there to think beyond, is because it's so fundamental to your sensory experience of the world. As you say, when you perceive everything as blue, visually, it's hard, not impossible, I would say, but hard, to determine that blue isn't just some universal property of everything. But matter is different. Now sure, it may be true that everything you experience is a material phenomenon, but that doesn't mean you perceive it that way. You don't perceive materialness the same way that you perceive blueness. Regardless of whether the world is material or immaterial or some mixture of both, what you perceive directly is not the material or immaterial nature of things. What you perceive is just the world. Your opinion on the nature of that world, on whether its nature is material or immaterial, is something you're going to reach by thinking about it. When you're this weird form of blue-only colorblind, you're going to perceive the world as all blue, whether you know what that is or not. You're physically incapable of doing otherwise. But if you just perceive the world in general, you're not going to perceive it in terms of its materiality. And I don't say that you're not going to interpret it in those terms. I say you're not going to perceive it in those terms. A person 50,000 years ago looking around the world would not see it as material the same way a colorblind blue-only person would see the world as blue. Because this isn't a matter of perception, it's a matter of philosophy, within which I of course include scientific understanding. Your perception of blue is a function of your eyes and your visual cortex. Your perception of material is a product of your intellect. It's a position you reach by thinking about the world in some deeper, more fundamental way than just how it looks. And if anything, that's the part that's comparable to thinking outside of your blue world and realizing there might be more. Realizing that there's a deeper nature to the world and that the things in it might be more than just that's a person, that's a rock, that's a cloud. Superficialities of perception and object recognition and basic identity. And the fact that we managed so long ago to move beyond that and realize that there's a nature to things beyond any of that, the fact that we realized that our perceptions weren't the be-all and end-all of reality, is yet another demonstration that your premise, which is based so heavily on the idea that humans must lack the imagination or insight to think beyond our limited perception, is deeply and fatally flawed. Now, having said that, of course the word material does distinguish from immaterial or not material, in the same way that real distinguishes from not real, or A distinguishes from not A, regardless of whether the speaker realizes or intends it. This in no way implies the actual reality or knowledge of non-material things, any more than real implies the reality or knowledge of non-real things, or in fact any more than blue implies the reality or knowledge of non-blue things. What it shows is that you can come up with labels, sometimes pointless labels in the case of blue, but still labels. But you've just claimed that this is impossible impossible based on, well, nothing. At least nothing you found worth mentioning. So what reason does anyone have to accept your premise or even take it seriously? Especially when it's possible to find examples that run contrary to it, like the real-unreal distinction. In any case, though, of course people distinguish between material and immaterial. Just in religion, there's a long history of this, which alone would be enough to dismiss and move on from this argument right now if I wanted to, at least until you bring anything to support your premise that it's impossible for humans to imagine how to make such a distinction. Assuming, of course, that the immaterial's not real, which I don't actually agree with. We'll talk about that later. For now, I think it's important to talk as if the immaterial is not real to show how your argument still doesn't work. Anyway, there's nothing unbelievable about some person thousands of years ago thinking, hey, when I move my body, stuff happens. But sometimes stuff still happens, even though there's nobody's body there. Maybe there's somebody who can make stuff happen but doesn't have a body. And there you have it. Not just a material-immaterial distinction, but specifically a religious-style distinction between material and immaterial actors in the world, created from thin air by an active imagination and agency detection that would be easy for anyone. But I should point out this is not quite the type of immaterial thing Brian's thinking of. He's thinking more like, I can grab my nose, but I can't grab my thoughts. Things I can grab are called stuff. Things I can't grab are called not stuff. That's more what he's talking about. Still not exactly a reach for people to come up with that.
The truth is, we have a whole range of rational experiences and perception that correlates to something non-material.
Yeah, I agree, at least on an abstract level. That's the funny thing is, up until this point, I kind of had to act like I don't agree with this to demonstrate the flaws in your argument. But of course I do agree with it, at least by a certain conception of immaterial. For example, velocity is immaterial. Mass is immaterial. Immaterial is literally anything where you're not talking about matter specifically. So things like properties, motion, abstractions, concepts, processes, and yes, ideas and colors, YouTube videos, YouTube itself. Plenty of these things relate to matter. In most of my examples, they only make any sense with reference to matter. Or energy, obviously. Just assume that when I say matter, that also means energy. But those things I listed aren't matter. They're not material objects. They might be things about matter, or things produced by matter. They might have a material origin, but they're not matter.
For example, I can think about numbers in a meaningful way. I can even do operations on them in my mind without ever having to associate them with something in the physical world.
Yes, I'm aware. The matter in your brain can do stuff. It doesn't just sit there.
I can also think about triangles and trees and animals in general.
What is that, a rock? That's cool. Did it erode into that shape? Cool. Erosion is immaterial. You can't show me a jar of erosion. So, it's basically magic.
Without ever having to reference them to a specific triangle, tree, or animal. These are known traditionally as universals. And in fact, all human thought, including scientific inquiry, is oriented to establishing this kind of knowledge. Every time we encounter something that we can perceive, we are trying to translate that from a particular instance into a general or universal knowledge.
So like, for example, if we were to perceive something specific like the color blue, we might try to translate that into a general or universal understanding of, color. I thought that was impossible or something, because it takes imagination and thinking beyond your immediate perception. And for some reason, we can't and don't do that, even though we do that all the time.
And this is actually our first instinct when it comes to rational thinking and asking questions of a rational nature. And I know this because I have little kids, and every time they see something for the first time, which is fairly often, they always ask the same question, which is, what is that? So let's imagine that they see a porcupine crossing the road for the first time, and they've never seen one of those before, which isn't that hard to imagine. So they ask, what is that? We're so used to asking and hearing this question that we don't tend to really dissect what's going on when we ask it, but really just think about it for a second. We're saying, I am now aware that a large rodent mammalian type creature with needles for hair exists. I've seen it, but now I want to know what it is. When we say what is that, we're saying I'm now familiar with the that in the question, but now I need to know what that is. In other words, I want to know what its essence is.
Sorry for the long clip, audience, but that was one thought that took a full minute to say. Brian, when your kid points at that porcupine and says, what is that? That's not a request for you to say, ah, "My child, allow me to explain to you the deepest essence of that creature." I don't know. You see, your kid's pointing to that and saying, "What is that?" Because your kid is hoping that you'll say, "Oh, that's called a porcupine." Your kid wants to know what it's called. That's what is that means. What's its name? Your little kid is trying to figure out how the English language works, not the immaterial, intangible, essential form of porcupine. And now I remember what the last video of yours that I responded to was about. I couldn't remember when I started. It's about this reification of the category or the form of a thing into something real beyond its actual configuration. Turning your sort of abstract idea of porcupine into something damn near material itself. Something as real as the thing's physical reality. And I remember being pretty entertained by this the last time, because this to me is batshit crazy. I mean, let's face it, this is an unbridgeable chasm between our worldviews. If this is what you're starting from, if these are your presuppositions, if this is the way that you're interpreting the world, I mean, that makes us almost not even able to speak to each other coherently on these topics. It's quite literally as if you're from another universe. A universe that functions entirely differently from the one I think we live in. Like on every level, to the point that I'm surprised that we could even agree on what's up and what's down. Seriously. Now that I think about it, I'm not 100% sure that we would agree on that.
It isn't enough for me to know that a specific instance of a thing exists. I need to know how it fits into the broader universal understanding of my knowledge.
That is not what a little kid is looking for from you. Trust me, man, I've tried, okay? My kid asks me something like, "What is that?" And I'll go into a big explanation of what category it's in, what its eating habits are, where it lives. If it has some interesting feature, I'll explain how it works. And at a certain point, you realize your kid's just sitting there kind of rolling her eyes because she only asked that to try to figure out what it's called. Look, if you want to do that stuff, that's cool. Be a good dad, encourage intellectual curiosity, and explain how things do fit into a broader picture, but that's you. That's not your kid asking for that. You're putting your own interests onto this little kid who just wants to know words, and then you're trying to use that to argue for the existence of a soul. I don't know, this video's weird.
And like I said, all scientific thought works this way. The aim of science is to make observations of new phenomena, which can then be translated into universal knowledge. We're always going from observations of specific instances into a general theory of a thing. We're going from observing an animal to understanding a species.
Sure, if you're using induction, if you're talking in terms of science, yes. That doesn't really hold with deductive reasoning, although I would argue that a lot of premises that are very general, all this are that, are general principles reached through specific examples. They're based on induction too, at least when we're talking about the real world. Point being, I'm with you. I'm not really disagreeing with you here, I'm just commenting.
Which tells us that when we think rationally, we're going from a specific to general, from a material instance to a spaceless, timeless form of knowledge.
Very weird way to say that, but sure. There's no the general polar bear out there for you to examine. There are only individual polar bears, by which you draw conclusions about polar bears in general, and there's no time or place in which the general polar bear is there. I hope you understand that we're over halfway through this video, and up to this point, the only thing that's really relevant that we've touched on is like, there are ideas, and sometimes they're general ideas about a category of thing that you haven't fully examined. Do you expect people to disagree with this? People who don't believe in the soul still believe that people have ideas, and people understand that the things that happen to matter, or the things that are products of matter, are not themselves matter. There's no dispute here. The disagreement isn't about whether people have ideas, or whether people reason from the specific to the general, or whether we talk about things that are not specifically material objects. I'm fully aware that people use adjectives and verbs and abstraction and categorization. I know. The disagreement isn't over whether these things happen. The disagreement is over how they happen. And considering the amount of time left in the video, I don't think you're going to be able to back up any claim about that. So how is it supposed to prove anything? Well, I guess I'll give you the chance. Go ahead.
When we reason, we're turning everything that we perceive, everything that we encounter, into something abstract that we can then organize and think logically about in our minds.
Okay, so what does any of this have to do with an immaterial soul?
Okay, so what does any of this have to do with an immaterial soul?
Yeah, that's what I just said.
Well, nobody's going to dispute the claim that we are material beings ourselves, right?
I don't know. I kind of thought that was the point of the video.
And how do we know this?
Our body composition matches the definition of material.
Well, because we have material experiences. We have material senses like taste, hearing, touch, and vision, which communicate the material and the physical world to us.
Okay, that's a remarkably narrow reason, just focusing entirely on the senses and no other aspect of the entity. But okay, interesting statement. If we perceive the physical world, we therefore must also be physical, because otherwise we would not be able to interact with the physical world, in this case by sensing it. Is that what you're saying? I think that's what you're saying. Which, if that's the assumption being made here, that excludes God as being able to perceive or interact with the world. Because interaction with the physical world apparently requires that you're physical yourself, and therefore implies that you're physical yourself. By the way, on the topic of weird ideas about God generated from this video, if we're saying that to have the word material, the concept of material, requires the real existence of non-material things, wouldn't that also imply that having the concept of things that are created by God would require there also to be things not created by God? Because otherwise everything around you is created by God, and therefore it's just like the color blue, everything around you is blue, so you have no reason to have a word for it. So God must have created only some of the universe, because otherwise the concept of creation by God wouldn't mean anything, and we wouldn't have been able to come up with it. It would have been literally impossible. Even if God inspired people to tell us about it in the Bible, it still couldn't make any sense to us. It would have to be nonsense to us, because if everything around you is created by God, the idea can't even be understood.
And from those experiences, it isn't a huge leap to say, well, hey, because I can interact with the material dimension of reality through my senses, I must be material myself. Well, what if you have experiences and a perception of a non-material nature?
I don't know, I guess you're going to go with dual nature kind of thing. But are you really taking it for granted that to interact with the physical world, you have to be physical? To observe the physical world, you have to be physical yourself? And maybe to observe the immaterial, non-physical world, you don't have to be. Maybe that's the dual nature thing, but at least God is partially a meat sack. And not just for that little bit of time when he was Jesus. Well, you're a Catholic. I guess you still have the thing that you eat the body and the blood of Christ. Do you guys actually believe that, like, this transcendent, immaterial God has a little meaty flesh pod hanging off his side in the form of Jesus? I don't know the theology on this, and I don't even think I want to know. It's too Lovecraftian for me. I'm just going to move on.
And I'm not just talking about that time you dropped acid and started hallucinating.
The less we talk about that, the better.
I'm talking about every moment of every day that you use your rational faculties. Every time you indulge the thought process behind the question, what is that? Every day we're having non-material experiences, which we've assumed can be isolated or traced back to a physical organ like our brains. But the fact is, there's nothing material about the ultimate content of our thoughts. It's immaterial, spaceless, and timeless, and cannot be isolated to our brains.
We're getting awful close to the end of the video here, and I'm still not hearing anything that would justify anything that you're saying. I mean, all I heard there was, nuh-uh, ideas can't come from a brain. Nope, can't be done. Okay, I'm willing to hear you out, but what is there to hear out? Your video is called How Matter Proves the Soul. And thus far the argument is humans reason and have ideas. It can't be the brain because I said so, therefore soul. What are you hoping to accomplish? Like, I know the idea of the soul. I've heard it a million times. Here's the thing I don't think the brain can do, therefore that's an immaterial soul. Yeah, I don't care what you think or don't think the brain can do. It's not even about the brain. Pretend we never even found out that humans have brains. That doesn't justify your position. The lack of an explanation is not evidence for your claim. It's not evidence for anyone's claim. It's a gap. If you decide to just fill it with whatever you want, nobody has to take you seriously, because that's fundamentally non-serious. Having said that, however, it is very interesting that you mentioned LSD, because that's a material substance being put into a material body, and when it reaches the material brain, it alters the ultimate content of your thoughts. The fact that LSD works is alone enough to put the ball firmly into the materialist's court. Feel free to say, nuh-uh, my soul.
Our brains are part of the process of thinking, but they don't explain the entire process.
Yeah, so nuh-uh, it's not the brain. We just gonna run out the clock with this, or?
And if our rational faculties are constantly interacting with something that is distinct from matter, again, a word that only has meaning because we can distinguish it from the non-material, then I think it's safe to say that our rational faculties have a non-material, or what you might call a spiritual sensory ability.
We can do math and calculate velocity and make generalizations and abstractions. And stuff you do isn't made of matter, so we must be sensing an immaterial world. Sorry, but I don't even know how to explain in words how shit that reasoning is. I think I'm just gonna leave it at saying it in a mocking voice.
Therefore, we are at least partly spiritual beings.
Therefore, are we at the end?
In closing, can I just say that if you don't find that persuasive, consider what we mean by the word material, especially if you think that describes the whole of reality. We mean that which can be perceived by our physical senses.
No, we mean matter and energy, and things related to the activity of matter and energy, which of course includes everything that you would consider immaterial, like human morality or logic, these being human concepts and feelings, which we generally and very justifiably tend to think about at a very high level of abstraction away from the basic level of the physical substrate. Because when you look at a meme on your smartphone, your first thought isn't about transistors and the physical nature of the meme. That's wildly impractical. For all intents and purposes, from the standpoint of daily human life, that meme is immaterial. Much like your video in your camera that you're using right now, the camera with no soul. A purely physical object that somehow contains and displays a video, an immaterial thing, despite this supposedly being impossible. Think about the layers of abstraction inside a computer. I found this image on secplicity.org. It does a good enough job. When you're talking about your immaterial things, you're talking at like the application layer, way up here. And when you talk about just matter and energy, you're talking way down here at the physical layer. Just because these are wildly different in terms of human perception, doesn't mean that they're unrelated. It doesn't mean that the application layer isn't ultimately the product of the physical layer. It's just hard to understand how it is because there's all that other stuff going on in between. And your brain makes it seem like the stuff that happens on the application layer is so distinct and self-contained, even though it's not. The GPU is material, the untextured sphere in Blender is immaterial. The cerebrum is material, logical thinking is immaterial. Great, we've slapped a label onto some abstraction of some level of physical reality. This isn't some transcendent spiritual thing.
So if you say only what is material actually exists, you're saying only what can be perceived by human physical senses exists.
No. If you say only what is material exists, you're saying only matter and energy exist. And of course, what they do physically. But to say that occurrences exist is a bit potentially confusing.
When we talk about the physical or the material world, we're talking about the world that exists according to our physical senses.
We definitely are not, man.
So we can talk about things that are visible. But if the word visible means anything at all, if that's comprehensible to us, it must admit that there is such a thing as invisible.
Now we're doing that with visible and invisible too? Yeah, well, I think there are things that are invisible and also not religious spooks. Now what?
And that this word describes some aspect of reality.
Yeah, no shit. There are plenty of things we can't see. There are plenty of things we can't observe. There are plenty of things we'll probably never be able to observe. Ever. Who do you think you're arguing against? Hey, atheists. You idiots use the word visible. Did you know that there's also stuff that's not? What do you think you're doing?
There are some measures of reality which are not available to our vision sense.
Are you seriously strawmanning atheists as saying, I only believe in stuff I can see right now? Is that really what you're doing right now? You're going that lowbrow here with your fancy vest and your books? Man, I like your presentation. Bring your presentation up to the level of your presentation, if you get what I'm saying.
And if so, then it's probably fair to say this is true for all of our senses. And what we're describing at that point is the incorporeal. The laws of morality, the laws of logic, the universals which all of our knowledge seems to be directed towards establishing, these are incorporeal realities. And the fact that you and I perceive them demonstrates that something about our intellect is also incorporeal.
Yeah, and that's the problem here, isn't it? We're thinking about these things on fundamentally different levels. I'm thinking of them as sort of abstract human understandings of worldly phenomena, things that happen which are open to investigation but really aren't that mind-boggling, and you're thinking of them as some sort of inaccessible, incorporeal, otherworldly intrusions into material reality. I don't think that's the only level on which we have a completely unbridgeable chasm of worldview here. I think we've encountered several of those through this video as well as the previous one. All of your arguments for your religious worldview seem to basically assume the truth of your religious worldview. I think that's what I'm really trying to say. And because that's the nature of your arguments, I'm sure they are real nice for your Catholic viewers, but there's no way for me to go down this path with you. To me, every one of your premises seems to be total nonsense. This whole last part here didn't sound like you arguing to me, it sounded like you preaching. But I think you intended it to sound like you're arguing, and I don't think we can get past that. You're basically just telling me what your religion says at this point, and all I can really do in response is tell you I don't agree with your assumptions and maybe tell you what I think instead, which is basically what I've done. Oh well, I guess. I don't know.
In the same way that because we can apprehend the material through our physical senses, we know that we are ourselves material. And it is this part of us that is incorporeal, that isn't traced back to some physical organ or some physical aspect of our bodies, that will continue to exist beyond the death of our body because it is not dependent upon the body.
Which, I mean, I hate to accuse you of this, but that sounds like it explains the motivated reasoning. Am I just in a bad mood, or was that especially painful? Probably both, actually. Okay, well, anyway, thank you for watching. The watching thing actually does help a lot. If you watch more than one video, that really helps, so, just saying. If you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't, and if you really like the channel, maybe consider supporting. A little bit is enormously helpful, and huge thanks to everyone who's made that choice. Early access, email list, list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.